So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first of a three-part series brought to you by We Don't Have Time TV and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme. We're here in Nairobi, Kenya. It's the global headquarters of UNEP to meet with the scientists, the technologists, the governments, the experts and the movers and shakers who are taking forward action on a group of pollutants that are variously described as short-lived climate pollutants, non-CO2 pollutants, or perhaps even better, super pollutants. These are substances such as methane, which come from multiple sources such as waste tips and the oil and gas industry, to agriculture as well, up to things like black carbon or soot, which comes from burning of diesel in trucks and cars, burning of agricultural waste and other areas. Faster action on these pollutants, the science strongly indicates, would give us all a better chance of meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement on time, while also having multiple benefits for public health, for agriculture, and for our precious ecosystems like forests. Today, in the first episode, we're going to look at the science of these super pollutants, and we're going to look at some of the technological solutions that could be possible to actually get rid of them from our environment as fast as possible. It comes at a very crucial time because governments have now decided they're going to increase ambition, hopefully it will be increased ambition, of their national climate plans, their so-called NDCs, as we look towards the next UN climate conference in Azerbaijan, and then, probably more importantly, in Brazil in 2025. Let me finally ask our viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org, and there you can actually sort of interrelate with the guests, pose questions, and generally be part of this show. First up, I've got Drew Schindel, or Drew Schindel. He's the chair of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition's Science Advisory Panel. He's also a professor at Duke University in North Carolina. And I think it's fair to say, a bit of a legend in this scientific field. Welcome, Drew.
Thank you.
Yeah. Drew, I want to give the viewers a bit of an idea about what these super pollutants are and why they're so absolutely nasty. So over to you.
Great. So as we've heard, methane is one of the key super pollutants. Black carbon is another that the coalition targets, and HCFCs, or hydrofluorocarbons, are the third major category. And as we just heard from Nick, methane comes from a variety of sources, including agriculture, including waste, including fossil fuels. To date, it's been responsible for roughly half of the total global warming that we've observed, even though it is not as long-lived in the atmosphere as something like carbon dioxide. Black carbon is interesting in that these soot particles come out almost always mixed with a bunch of other things. And so it's difficult to assess the effect of black carbon on its own. We look at the co-pollutants and their total effect, everything that's emitted together, another couple tenths of a degree. HCFCs, in contrast to the other two, are not currently causing a lot of warming, but what would happen is they would lead to a great deal of global warming if we didn't control them. And so they're a danger more for the future. Now, why we're really interested in these within the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is that methane leads to ozone formation in the lower atmosphere. Ozone is good up in the stratosphere, but down here at the ground, bad for us when we breathe it, toxic, roughly 500,000 premature deaths per year. Black carbon and its co-emitted pollutants kill around 3 million people per year. So when we think of people dying from stroke and heart attack and so-called natural causes, often these are not natural, but are induced by environmental changes. If you put all of these together, since they're short-lived, if we control black carbon and its co-emissions and methane, these actually provide the strongest leverage we have to lower the amount of climate damages people will experience over the next few decades. They don't substitute for carbon dioxide mitigation, which is crucial for the long term, but they complement it by really reducing the damages people are already feeling now, alongside the decarbonization we need to prevent damages to future generations.
Yeah. So in other words, there are potentially some quick wins here that if we really move very quickly could indeed help us halve emissions by 2030, which is what the science says we need to do, which could set the stage for keeping a global temperature on this planet at 1.5 degrees centigrade on average, or below would be even better, but maybe that's Nick dreaming on here. But they could really give us a pathway, a rescue pathway in a sense to humanity to help us maybe not overshoot in terms of climate change with all the appalling possibilities that go with it. Okay, Drew, stay with us. Thank you very much indeed. That's really helpful. We've got some other wonderful guests with us. As you can see, I'm sitting on this fantastic, almost 1970s retro sofa. If you describe it like that, people go, wow, it's actually really attractive. If I didn't describe it that way, they might say something else. But they're with us here in the studio. And let me first turn, actually, I'm going to first turn to Ilse Aben. Aben, is that correct?
Aben.
Aben. Okay, Ilse Aben. She's a senior scientist in the Earth Group at SRON. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Netherlands Institute for Space Research. To be
That's
precise.
fantastic. The Netherlands Institute for Space Research. Very good. Tell us, what is your work doing to bring to the table in the sense of acting on these short-lived climate pollutants?
Right. So I work at the Research Institute using space-based observations. We develop instruments, satellites, or parts of satellite instrumentation, and also use the data that come from these satellites. And in my group, we look a lot at methane. And well, there's been a real revolution going on for the past 5 years in this field and in measuring methane from space. And so, past 5 years, let's say, and so 6 years ago, we launched this satellite that can measure methane globally every day. And each individual observation looks at an area of only 5 by 7 kilometers. But then for the whole globe, right? So that's like 20 million observations a day, every day, again. And it turned out that this instrument was capable to see for the first time, we see these methane super emitters. So these are very localized hotspots, plumes of methane coming from major leaks, like from, for example, leaks in oil and gas infrastructure. And so for the first time, we now had a global view on these methane super emitters, showing us like hundreds of these super emitters. We had no idea. They can be persistent, they can be just events, for example, blowouts, or intermittent. And we had no idea where these would be. So now we have a picture every day where we see them. And on top of that, we were teaming up with other satellites that can then zoom in at these locations and measure methane at 25-meter resolution. So that's at facility level scale. They can really pinpoint then what is leaking. And that's been really very strong. Powerful tool to identify then what is causing these leaks. So we've seen leaks from the oil and gas infrastructure, from coal mining, and from wastes. So basically landfills and waste dumps.
Good. Let's hold it there. And we'll come back when we have our debate, because it raises so many fascinating questions. Maybe the one quick question, the quick answer is, when you see some of these super leaks of methane from the satellites, are they factored into the global, or to the models, or to the national claims that governments make in terms of their levels of pollution, or not? Are they
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay, good. That's a very useful thing already that you've just told us. Let me move to this gentleman over here. I'm going to ask you who you are and where you're from first.
Jonathan Banks with the Clean Air Task Force.
Okay. And the Clean Air Task Force, but you're also with EDF, is that right?
That's the other John.
Ah, that's the other John. Oh, there we go.
It's easy to get confused.
Two new guests in the show, they both wearing the same coloured suits, different trousers, that's true, we can tell them apart from that, but very similar haircuts. Okay, this is going to
I'll
be
be John Blue
fascinating.
Trousers.
It sounds like, what was the Lewis Carroll thing with Tweedledum and Tweedledee? I can't remember. But anyway, okay, tell us what you're contributing to this, this story of trying to deal with the short-lived climate pollutants.
Sure. So Clean Air Task Force is a nonprofit organization that works on climate and energy around the world. And we have a large focus on methane emissions within our organization. We work on agriculture emissions, waste emissions, coal mine emissions, as well as oil and gas. I'll talk mostly about the oil and gas space, but we work with countries and governments around the world to help them develop solutions and policies that can move forward in reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. When Drew talks about the potential bending of the climate curve that we see with methane emissions, the very first piece that we can really make huge progress on is the oil and gas space. Ilse was talking about these big leaks that we're now able to see with the satellites. We can see different kinds of leaks at the ground level too, smaller leaks that add up to a lot of emissions. And working with governments and companies from around the world, we're developing policies and helping countries to implement those that can really start to cut emissions. Between now and 2030, we can get 75-80% reduction in emissions from the oil and gas sector with technologies that are available today.
Okay, good. Sophie Punta? Punta, okay. And you're with the Freight Center.
Yeah, no, I founded the Smart Freight Center 10 years ago, which is a global non-profit organization focused on decarbonizing freight, all modes, everywhere around the world.
All right.
And I'm also on the board of Mylands. And Mylands is a joint venture between Traton, Volvo, and Daimler Trucks. They invested $500 million in charging infrastructure for long-distance trucks in Europe.
Okay. So what you're bringing to the table then is getting rid of basically black carbon from the emissions of heavy goods vehicles. Is that part of the central focus of your work?
Yeah, it's part because you're looking at trucks or freight, and it's not just greenhouse gas, it's also short-lived pollutants and air pollution. There's a band. However, what I should say is that the main reason why companies are interested in doing this is greenhouse gas. So it's almost like if they're able to reduce CO2 emissions with trucks, we can also get rid of the black carbon. And our work very much focuses on organizing action by bringing the customers of freight, so for example, an Amazon or IKEA or Unilever, who can put the demand on the clean freight, the carriers, so like a DHL or Maersk, but also individual trucking companies, and then everybody around them, like the automotive manufacturers, and then wider community like research or government, to say, how are we going to get action happen on the ground? Specifically on electric trucks, what we do is we first create a demand. So we brought together major customers. And for example, for Europe and the US, they've collectively committed to 60,000 long-distance electric trucks by 2030. And we use that to go to manufacturers and say, here's the demand, can you organize the supply? And then they commit to making the supply happen. And then we work with other partners, how are we going to get the charging infrastructure in place and then the surrounding policies. And we're now having concrete projects happening. There's 3 corridors in China already. There is a corridor project going to happen from Los Angeles to Texas in the US. We're looking at a corridor in Europe as well. And now we're looking even at the Northern Corridor in Africa, together with Kuhne Foundation and Coldstart. So so why an NGO is needed is because there's so many players that are needed to get involved, and someone's going to orchestrate that action, and that's what we do.
Okay. So, our other John, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, good. Thank you for having me here. My name is John Tousell. I'm the Senior Director for Global Agriculture Methane at the Environmental Defense Fund.
Okay, fantastic. Now, you're working on something called digital extinctions, which is nothing to do with hair, is it? It's not some funny way of... Okay. Tell us briefly what it actually, or maybe a solid example of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for our viewers out there and for everybody here, I focus on agriculture methane. As we know, reducing methane is the fastest way to slow the rate of climate change. Agriculture represents about 40% of methane sources from human-related causes. Agriculture is also faced with this challenge that we have to feed 50% more people. We need 50% more food by 2050. That's essentially us all buying the same groceries, double the groceries from January through June. And farmers want to do the right thing. And so we're focused on these triple win solutions about how can you help farmers improve food production, how do you help them improve their livelihoods, and how do you help them reduce the climate impact they're having. There, you really need solutions that get on the ground with farmers. And so one of the things that we're interested in are technical solutions, so extension services. We know there's a long legacy of farmers need help to implement best practices, and those come through trusted and trained advisors. That's a really expensive process for countries to deploy, and we now know we have technical solutions that can help support that and reduce that cost to help farmers implement these practices through digital technologies. So that's one area we're looking at. The other interesting thing about these digital technologies, so think about a farmer with an app or an SMS message that reports back in the great work that they're doing, that enables low-cost MMRV, what we're calling monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification, so that then we can enable new financing for them to actually take these practices to market. So imagine that we could provide small incentives to farmers to implement new practices enabled through digital technology reporting.
And you can stop, or cows won't burp as much if these digital...
So they'll burp as much, but I think the methane in their burps, so again, it's the burps, that's fundamentally when cows, it's the burps. What we can do is we can help farmers implement practices. We know, for example, if farmers provide better nutrition for their cows, that actually improves productivity so that the farmer gets more milk per cow, better milk per cow, and it also reduces the overall methane emissions per unit of milk produced.
Okay, stay with us. Andrea Hinwood is UNEP's chief scientist, and she also has a background in air quality from her native Australia. You're in a very special position as the UNEP chief scientist because you're kind of like the satellite over the whole world in a sense about what's going on.
I wish.
But we were chatting a little bit before we started the show, and in a sense, you bring a kind of other perspective. It may well be that we're dealing with the legacy of a former industrial era, right? And we're having to work out how to move to a new era and deal with the problems and the legacies of what we had from the past, right? But there could be a vision of a future whereby, for example, waste tips produce a lot of methane, don't they? That's again a short-lived climate pollutant. But should we have waste in the future? It's these kinds of concepts that I think you were. Tell us what your thinking is.
Yeah, I guess what's great about hearing from our panel is that solutions exist. So we know we've got air pollution problems. We know that methane is a short-lived climate pollutant that contributes significantly to global warming. But we also know we have solutions. But the other bit about this is all of these issues are interrelated. So your production of emissions is associated with emissions of greenhouse gases. Your oil and gas industry is producing greenhouse gases, but it's also producing air pollution, your transport and all the rest of it. But at the moment, we're still looking at them in a siloed way and not in an integrated way. And so we need to start talking about the co-benefits, because often we're saying, well, we can tackle methane, but if we tackle methane, we will also tackle climate change. We will tackle ozone, tropospheric ozone formation. We will also be able to tackle more efficiency in agriculture. We will be able to deal with environmental degradation from agricultural practices to make them more efficient to feed the world. We will be able to address refrigeration and cooling because we'll actually start to integrate passive designs and ways of actually reducing demand while actually providing cooling for a warming world. So I think the message that we are certainly starting to talk about is how do we actually integrate across these issues, across pollutants, and that's exactly what the Climate and Clean Air Coalition does. And of course, UNEP is the Secretariat for the International Methane Observatory. So the more that we can actually cross disciplines and actually start to look at solutions, and I'm sure there are many, many more solutions that we've got that will actually provide benefits across the range of environmental issues that we're dealing with.
So at this point, I think we just need to have a chat among ourselves and maybe just dig slightly deeper in this. I mean, it strikes one that the science that you're talking about as well has been growing and growing and growing over the years. It seems that some governments have heeded the science to an extent. There has been movement forward on climate action and lots of other things, but not as fast as we wanted. At the same time, there's been massive, I think, entrepreneurial, creative solutions. I mean, who would have, I would not have said 10 years ago that my favorite sausage happens to be a vegan sausage from a manufacturer in Germany, right? I always liked old bangers, you know, and they call them in Britain and probably in Australia too. So, I mean, things have changed quite rapidly for me in terms of what I eat, for example, and what's been done in that sector. Electrification of transportation is coming very fast and seems pretty unstoppable now. Renewable energy is tripling or doubling every, is it 2.5 years or something like that? Anyway, so lots of things, but we're still way behind the curve, aren't we? So how do we, for example, bring you're monitoring methane, that's great, but how does that then, could it be more of an accountability mechanism as well, that you could bring to governments and say, well, have you noticed, by the way, that your methane emissions are actually a damn sight higher than what you've been telling the UNFCCC? Or, I don't know, something like that, Ilse. I mean, could it be, maybe the Dutch government would have to
Right.
do that rather than you, Ilse, but...
Well, actually, so what I was saying about these satellites seeing these super emitters, and that's sort of the low-hanging fruit if you want to take action, right? Reduce methane, because these are very localized, huge sources of methane. And Andrea was mentioning the UNEP's IMEO, the International Methane Emission Observatory. And the great thing is that basically it's there to support governments and companies to reduce their methane emissions and fulfill the global methane pledge. But they started now with the methane alert response system that has been operational since last COP, where they use this information from the satellites, these super emitters and the identification, and basically notify governments and companies about what we're seeing from space and asking them, what are you going to do about it? And but in the meantime, they're also giving support to these governments and companies. They have these partnerships with oil and gas methane partnership, for example. I think I just read 122 oil and gas companies. So that's really very important to have this engagement with the stakeholders and be in continuous communication also with governments. And I think that's, I mean, we've done our research in a way. We'll keep supporting this. But of course, for researchers is usually where it stops. But I'm very happy with this development that actually something can be done very concretely with all of this information.
I'm glad you mentioned the private sector there, because we haven't really, I mean, we sort of touched on it there with the freight, but I mean, one thing that helped the Paris Agreement, of course, was that there was a lot of private sector in Paris at the level of CEOs saying we want a global deal on climate change. And actually the private sector was quite interesting in Dubai, actually, because, I mean, the progressive private sector stood up and said, we want to do something about fossil fuels, right, and things like that. So the private sector is important. Do the science-based targets help? And I'm thinking with the freight sector, right, because if you're Scania or Volvo Group or something like that, you want to reduce your emissions because you promised to do them, but your whole supply chain has to also act too. Exactly. So, and then the supply chain has science-based targets, and they're putting more pressure on Scania or Volvo Group to act at the top. So it's like a beneficial, it's like people hitting each other with twigs, right? It's sort of, it's good for your health and probably you'll find a place in heaven, Yeah. Is that right? Do we feel the private sector has a big role in all this somewhere?
Oh, absolutely.
They're essential. They're essential. Without them, we can't solve the problems. So, yeah.
But I suppose the science-based target helps because if government sets a direction, right, net zero emissions by 2050, or if you make it for a sector, Europe says 90% zero emissions trucks on the road by 2040. That sets the North Star. Private sector then matches that with we've got science-based targets that are in a way comparable, but it's their version of setting targets. But what is then often missing is that organizing action between them. Yeah. So I take again the example of a truck. I've heard policymakers in Europe say on the radio, we cannot have heavy-duty trucks being electric because the batteries become too big. Guess what? Last month, Heineken put a long-distance heavy-duty truck on the road in Europe, and there's already several driving in there. So it's possible, but it's just we need that almost connection and reinforcing collaboration with a company testing a truck so that the government gets confident, oh, now we can set the targets. So the charging infrastructure are willing to invest in building the infrastructure so that the Volvos and others are thinking, ooh, heavy-duty trucks are going to be electric. Let's invest in new models. And it's about figuring out what the dynamic is, where the private sector plays a critical role, but they cannot do it alone. They need policymakers to stand their ground and really stick to the goals they promised under Paris.
Right. Yeah. Is that? I mean, most oil and gas companies don't have science-based targets, so that's really not an issue there. But
it's
bring us your perspective on this. How do we move them along?
It's true in the oil and gas sector as well, and I think what Sophie's pointing out is a critical piece that because you have progressive companies within the oil and gas sector that are saying, we're going to reduce our methane emissions to near zero. We're going to reduce our flaring to zero routine flaring. You have lots of progressive companies. We're talking about, reporting their emissions with really good granular detail. But that's not universal across the planet. And what we have always found is that missing piece, as Sophie was talking about, is that you can have a progressive company that's operating in a country with, 4 non-progressive companies. You need policy that levels the playing field and forces everyone to adhere to the best practices that actually reduce methane emissions. And I think that's that piece that has to come in. In the oil and gas sector, the technologies exist. We always say it's not rocket science, it's plumbing. And it literally is plumbing in many cases. It's tightening bolts, it's replacing flanges, it's closing lids on tanks so that they're not spewing methane emissions into the atmosphere. This isn't really hard to do. It's just you need to force companies in many cases to do it. There are progressive ones, but you have to level the playing field, and that's where policy comes into play.
Is it the case, though, that for some oil and gas companies, those fugitive, there you go, I'm sounding like a bureaucrat now, these leaks of methane, right, coming out of pipes or flarings or whatever they're doing, have never been of enough economic value to them? So isn't there a policy there that's very simple, like either put a price on carbon or
Emissions
reduce
trading.
fossil fuel, or reduce fossil fuel subsidies, right?
That's,
and
again,
rebalance and calibrate the landscape.
It depends on the part of the system that you're looking at, but that is exactly why you need policy, that you need regulation that forces them to value those emissions that are going into the atmosphere. In certain parts of the system, those emissions are not worth it to the company that's releasing it. There's also all sorts of other barriers. You can have a pipeline owned by one company and the gas that's going through it owned by another company, and they don't really care how much methane is leaking out of the pipeline as long as it's not over the contract limit. So there's all sorts of reasons that policy comes into play. If you put regulation in place, it forces companies to prioritize that. Even within a company, you can have competing forces in a company. You can have a part of a company that says, we're working on reducing methane emissions, and you have a part of a company that's working on drilling new wells. Those two parts of the company compete for the same capital in the company. These guys make more profit drilling wells, even though this is profitable by capping methane leaks. These guys make more profit, so they get more priority. You put policy in place, the playing field's leveled.
So we need policy. Do we need a new concept of economics? Do we need new indicators of wealth?
Well, first of all, we need to value the environment above the economy in the first instance, so that as an entity, your social responsibility is to make sure that your activities are doing everything that you can do to minimise your impact on the environment. So I would have that discussion with the oil and gas industry to say, do everything you can that is reasonably practicable. And that includes, you might have to reduce your profit margin for a bit. Why? Because if you reduce those emissions, you said at the outset, we're talking about quick wins here. We are increasing our temperature. We are seeing this happen. Everyone is feeling this. I think there's nowhere on the globe at the moment. So everyone has a social responsibility to actually do as much as they can to be as efficient and protect the whole world, but importantly, it also buys a bit of time for those really hard to manage emissions, and that's across all of the areas. You talked about waste. We know that the waste is a significant source of methane, but actually there are probably a whole range of actions we can take as well. So we need the policy settings, but we also need the industries to value the environment as a priority so that they take the right solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sorry, going back to agriculture again. I mean, agriculture has always been, it's always been such a difficult thing to do with agriculture, because there's always been the kind of chemical companies on one side and then the organic people on the other side, and then never the twain shall meet, and it was always very polarized. It seems to all come very happily now around maybe regenerative agriculture, which is a bit more do you get a sense that, and I get a sense from the previous climate COPs as well, from Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, that there's a lot more interested in food and agriculture and how to environmentally, handle it, and the same in Dubai. Did you get a sense that there is a change in more sustainable agriculture coming?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so
That will include reductions in short-lived climate pollutants, of course.
exactly. Yeah, no, I think very broadly, again, methane, 40% of methane from human-related sources is from agriculture, and about 30% of overall GHGs are from agriculture. And so what we've seen at the past two COPs, somebody once said, well, agriculture used to be at the kids' table in the climate conversations. Now it's at the grown-ups table, right? And we recognize, and agriculture is actually really productive now and focused on how do they drive solutions. So they had about 130 countries in Dubai who committed to thinking about climate and climate-resilient food systems moving forward. Going to the corporate action part that you talked about and the role of corporates, we see that as absolutely critical for food and beverage companies and food and agriculture companies to step forward. In fact, in Dubai, we had 6 global dairy companies step forward to develop the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, where these companies are actually committing to reporting methane as a separate gas. And they've developed, in the first year, they've committed to developing a methane action plan where they're actually going to start taking steps to reduce methane from their supply chain.
But the elephant in the room, I can say that because we're in Kenya, the elephant in the room is do we actually, have we got too much livestock on the planet? I mean, there are some people would say, yes, we need to reduce the emissions from the livestock, but actually we've overstocked the land. And I know that it's a difficult debate, but I know there are some organizations been working on this. There was a 30 by 40, was it? Or so we'd reduce 30% by 2040 or 2030 or something of livestock.
30 by 30, right?
Yeah, there we go.
30, yes, 30. Yeah,
Because that kind of fits in a little bit with thinking out of the box, because we're trying to deal with the methane emissions from livestock, but do we have too much livestock? I'm only thinking because my mum always tells me that we only ate beef once a week when we were kids rather than every day. But,
yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that diet is a really social, cultural aspect to it. It has an economic aspect to it as well. So we know that animal protein, for example, has a very dense nutrition. And so particularly for people who can't afford a lot of nutrition, it provides a really dense source. So I think overall what our focus is how do we take the livestock we have and make them more efficient and reduce that overall footprint from the livestock sector. And so there are people who are thinking about, if you have the economic ability to think about diets, that's one area to think about. There's a lot of innovation in the diet space as well, recognizing we need more food collectively across the planet. And then our focus is how can we help take the livestock emissions that we have today and reduce those overall. And so helping farmers move those solutions forward, I think, is key, which is why I think digital technologies to help lower those costs is important.
Can I build on that?
Yes.
Because it's about demand management, right?
or woman management.
What? I said the
Oh,
man.
I thought you said man management. I wanted to make sure we had gender balance in this program.
You cannot manage me. But we can talk about making trucks electric, but the fundamental problem is of course, why do we need to transport so much goods around the world?
Yep.
And so part of it is about demand management, part of it is about mode shift. And I'll give you for Europe the example. The German government introduced an 80% increase in toll fees for diesel trucks and exempted electric trucks from having to pay toll fees to try and make the cost of switching lower. But truck companies can only change if they have the charging infrastructure, but also can only switch to rail if there's rail infrastructure. Now, one country that has successfully developed that is Switzerland. So Switzerland's strategy to get less trucks on the road was to invest in reliable rail infrastructure. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure about the agriculture sector, but it's sometimes investing in alternative meats, because I now see them in supermarkets I didn't see 10 years ago. That might have a bigger contribution to the switch than trying to force people to stop the bad behavior. You encourage an alternative behavior.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe you need a sort of two-process thing where you're encouraging better behavior with incentives and quietly pushing things behind the scenes. I don't know.
It's much more positive. Yeah.
Are we missing anything here? We haven't really talked about HFCs but I mean, Dubai, there was the global cooling pledge, was it? 68% reduction?
That's to meet, because of course the demands for cooling are going to be massive. But of course, if we actually introduce a whole range of measures, we can actually provide cooling to many parts of the world that are really vulnerable and that actually need that cooling, while also reducing methane and emissions from HCFCs, etc. So the Kigali Amendment becomes very important in terms of phasing out of HFCs. And so we need to implement some of those rules that we already have in the cooling sector. But it's a similar thing. How do we join up? Building design, housing design, planning our cities for livable cities, the 20-minute neighbourhood, because all of those actions actually reduce emissions across a range of different sectors and will have health benefits as well. So I think if we start to think in a more integrated fashion, we'll probably achieve, better outcomes. But Drew was going to talk about the
I was just going to add
CFCs.
that, I think as we do things like reduce our methane and therefore reduce the rate of warming and bend the curve, we reduce the need for all of this cooling. And all of these things really do kind of link together. And just going back for a moment to the livestock, some of the sectors that are most difficult to decarbonize are things like aviation, where we have, less than 1% of the needed sustainable fuel now. There's steel making, metal smelting, right? All these things. And typically what we do when we look at futures that keep within our climate goals is we say, we offset all these by planting trees. But where do you plant the trees? Well, you need land, and typically the only way that you have arable land that you can get is to have fewer cows taking up that land. And so that goes back to your question about the livestock. When people have looked, if you switch places like most of the Americas, where consumption is far above healthy dietary guidelines, just down to healthy levels, right? You're not banning steaks and hamburgers, but you're getting people to eat the amount that's good for them. Then you free up enough land to really allow for the decarbonization trajectory and really reaching net zero. So all these things do really intermesh together.
Yeah, we live in a world that's really quite exciting in terms of change, and green steel now being produced. Volvo cars in Scandinavia getting green steel from a green steel maker in the Nordics. You see all these things coming through. There's a company in Wales, I think, that has a way of using a mineralization process to create concrete rather than using high temperatures in kilns or whatever it is required to make it normally. So loads of that innovation going on. The question is it moving fast enough? And again, that comes back to policy, whether you actually support innovation. It also comes back to whether policy supports the early stages as well, right? Because I read something in the International Monetary Fund that only 10%, there's only 10% of patents now that relate to kind of green tech than there were, was it 10 years ago? So there's been a slump in patenting of smart ideas. Again, coming back to policy, which is the subject of tomorrow's show. So we'll probably put our foot well and firmly on that one, but we can't really avoid it. Any last thoughts? Can we do it? Do you think we can achieve, Andrea? Can we deal with this problem?
Of
yes
course,
or no?
absolutely. And indeed, I think this is the time. Never have we talked about these issues in this way across different sectors. We have the wherewithal, we know what we need to do, we have the solutions, we simply need to just get on and do it. So I'm firmly of the view that we can, and we can buy ourselves that time to deal with the really hard issues that we've got to face.
And Drew, I'll also give you the last word here because you opened it up. How do you? You've been at this game a very long time, Drew.
Yes.
I think you were even involved way back when Klaus Topfer, the executive of UNEP, executive director, flew in a light aircraft over the Himalayas and saw black soot across Mount Everest and said, "We got to do something."
Well, I think now it is kind of an exciting time because, as Andrea just said, we know what to do, but there's been some real motion and some creativity, I would say. And so, for example, with the Global Methane Pledge, we have all these countries that launched the pledge, but the action on the ground has been really intriguing. In the United States, for example, we've been trying to get a carbon price in place for decades, complete failure, but we now have a price on methane emissions, which sailed through bipartisan support. In Europe, they don't produce a lot of methane from fossil fuel within the bloc, but they've used their capacity as buyers to impose restrictions on fuel that comes into the bloc. And so people are coming up with ways that I haven't seen before. And it extends to, developing countries as well. Nigeria has some very laudable regulations. So I'm excited that we're starting to move, as you've been saying. It's never fast enough, but we're making a lot of progress compared to where we were just even a few years ago on methane.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for being with us on this first episode about the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. We'll hope the viewers will join us tomorrow where we're going to look a little bit more deeply at policy, not just in the United States or Europe, but also in Africa and other developing countries. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick.
So we've come to the end of a lovely day here at UNEP headquarters in Nairobi, where we've been making a We Don't Have Time TV show, episode 1, with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition hosted by UNEP. And we've been looking today at the science of these so-called super pollutants and also technological solutions. This is kind of a bonus interview at the end of the day, and we've got 2 wonderful guests. Could you say first who you are and where you're from?
Hello, Nick. I'm Martina Otto. I'm heading the Secretariat of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition.
Okay. And over to you.
Hi, Nick. I'm Brian Carroll from Ireland, and I'm the Assistant Secretary General for Environment, covering climate, air quality, UN International in Ireland.
Okay, just a small job then, Brian. Covering everything, right. Martina, we talked a lot about technology today with some wonderful guests from around the world, and there is something called TEEP, which is the Technical or Technological...
Technology and Economic Assessment Panel.
Fantastic. And this is actually underpinning a lot of the work you're doing to try and rid the world of these super pollutants, to bring solutions to countries around the world that are cost effective. Just tell us a little bit about what is the work of this body.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Nick. And today we already heard, we got a real glimpse of what is out there. There's so many different technology solutions. It can be a little bit overwhelming. And so we have this tool that we put together, the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel, that will allow us to identify promising technologies and to help assess a bit more what they're about, tell the story of what they're about, but also look at business models that can be applied to scale them up. And then also look into the finance of this. What does it cost to roll out those solutions? And thereby we hope to bridge this gap between the technologies existing and being proven and not enough money going into them for them to be scaled up.
Okay. So Brian, you're chair of this body, a co-chair or chair?
Co-chair with Senegal.
With Senegal. All right. It's always the same in the UN. There's always a developed country and a developing country. And that's a really brilliant idea. Tell us a little bit about how you see the work of this organization, its value.
Yeah, I think it is a huge value to bring, particularly in accelerating implementation. There are technologies existing already that could be implemented at scale and really rapidly reduce methane. And what the TEEP is looking at is, what are these technologies and why aren't they being implemented? What's the economics around it? Do they stand up as an investable proposition in their own right? Do they require additional, maybe public money to have them adopted, to understand the economics around it, the business model, and then to look beyond that as well into specific contexts and say, are there cultural or behavioral barriers to their adoption? And see if we can unravel those factors and actually get projects where you have a known technology being implemented at scale and connected with the finance to roll them out. That's really what the TEEP is about in a nutshell, and it has massive potential to accelerate implementation.
I mean, we live in a big world. I can't remember how many countries there are in the UN system, 193 maybe, or something like that anyway. So all at different points of economic development, different challenges with these short-lived super pollutants and different economic growth patterns and so on and so forth, different landscapes indeed. So is TEEP looking at, in support of the action agenda of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, things that are specific to, say, African countries or North African countries versus, say, South African countries or Asian countries or individual countries, Chile, for example? Is it looking at that, or is it trying to create technologies that are silver bullets everywhere, Any of you, yeah?
I think there's a lot of technologies that can be applied in very different country and regional contexts, but then they have to be adapted. The way we apply them needs to be adapted. The policies, whatever it takes, the financing mechanisms. And I think that's where the granularity does come in. The technology per se is there. But then that's why we talk about archetyping, wonderful jargon word, but really looking at different types of countries that maybe have similar preconditions. And that can be within a region, that can also be across a region, and then facilitate the learning and also reach out on the different business models and what it takes.
Good.
No, I'd agree with Martina there. And the work at the TEEP is really starting now. And obviously, the technologies will have to be understood within their cultural or regional context and the variations there. So it'd be great if there was a silver bullet that could be universally applied everywhere, but unfortunately, no.
We only use silver bullets against vampires, and they don't exist anyway. So, so finally, I wanted to ask you this bonus interview, bonus question, Martina. There was a lot of talk yesterday, and it never came out in the show, about something called soldier flies. And I was like, okay, sure, we have to mention this somehow. What the devil are soldier flies, and how could they be applied? I know the TEEP's looking at these.
Exactly. It's one of the areas that we looked at first under the TEEP. We did say we take a technology that's a bit more upstream and one a bit more downstream. The more upstream is black soldier fly technology, and downstream is biocovers that we looked at. But black soldier flies, and to call it technology is really interesting because it's actually a nature-based solution. It's what happens in nature, but we put it into a specific context. And what is it in a nutshell is that we have organic waste that is being treated by those black soldier flies, and what comes out is protein. It's actually an upcycling. It's an upcycling, and the protein could be used as animal feed, for example. And there's a whole business model around that this becomes a viable business. And it can be done at a very small scale. Here in Kenya, for example, there is women's associations that are dealing with that. So it happens at that level. If we go to South Africa, they're much bigger farms already. So it's very adaptable as well to the context. And in the CCAC, we've been supporting, for example, Peru to look at what does it take to adapt this to the context.
The soldier flies go into the waste stream, and they somehow eat the organic waste and stop it producing methane, which causes global warming and is one of the super pollutants, and produces protein, which could be then as animal feed.
Exactly.
So this is the circular economy in action, courtesy of the soldier fly.
Yes.
Okay, why not? All right, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for this bonus interview, and have a great day.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.